And when Egyptians saw that happen, it set the imagination on fire, not just in Egypt, but across the Middle East and North Africa. To see an actual Arab leader being forced to flee was amazing. And so those who went out to protest on January the 25th had that on their side, that everybody had watched Ben Ali flee. So when they started marching on the streets in Cairo, in Alexandria, and it's important to remember it wasn't just in Cairo, in Suez, in villages in southern Egypt, they had that on their side. But then you saw even more strands coming together. You had the young people who I've mentioned that were apolitical and had begun to be politicized in 2005. You had women who knew that the Egyptian police, because this was a target, the regime would target women with sexual abuse and assault during demonstrations. This began as an actual campaign by the Egyptian regime in 2005. But you saw women on Twitter, on Facebook, send each other advice on how to protect themselves against being targeted by sexual assault from the regime. So they would send tweets to each other and messages saying things like, if you wear a headscarf, wear 2 headscarves. Don't wear anything with a zipper. Take a can of mace or a can of hairspray, a can of anything, so that you can spray it in the eyes of anyone who tries to assault you. So you saw all these various groups that came together and went out on the streets. But when they went out on the streets on January the 25th, other Egyptians now who had not been involved in any of this, that then galvanized them. And I know from Egyptian revolutionaries who had been taking part in the meetings running up to January the 25th, that the main condition was, we want the resignation of the interior minister in Egypt. But when Egyptians saw them, average Egyptians now, not involved in these committee meetings, saw them march on the street, years of anger, years of poverty, years of repression by the Mubarak regime, all came together. This was another way of connecting now. And they went out on the street, and average Egyptians who had not called for the January 25th protest, they themselves began to call for the toppling of the Hosni Mubarak regime. They're the ones who started saying, down, down with Hosni Mubarak. So you had a whole bunch of revolutionaries basically running to catch up with these Egyptians who themselves started saying, down, down with Hosni Mubarak. And it was a great moment of all of these strands coming together. Because as I said in the beginning, it's important to remember that this was not an overnight thing. Egyptians didn't just wake up in the morning on January the 25th and say, we need to get rid of Mubarak. And those strands continue their work, because you see the human rights activists, the labor movement, which was very instrumental in the run-up to the Egyptian revolution. In 2008 especially, some of you might have heard of the labor movement. For over the past probably 7 or 8 years in Egypt, we've had numerous strikes, many more than we've had for a long time, building up. And one of the main fears of the Egyptian regime was that these labor activists would connect with all these other activists in the way that we saw it happen in the run-up to January the 25th. And in 2008, Mahal al-Kubra, a town in the Nile Delta, saw a huge strike in one of the main textile factories in Egypt. And that, again, became another catalyst. Because on January the 28th, on 2008, April 6th, 2008, many activists in other fields in Egypt, youth activists, human rights activists, and labor activists, had that coming together that the Egyptian regime feared. So on January the 25th, you had the protest in Cairo, but just as importantly, the protest in Mahalla, where the workers remembered what happened to them on April the 6th, 2008, because basically their town was invaded by thousands of police and riot police, and many people died in the crackdown on that strike. So you had the comings together, you had all these strands, and online now, what you see happening, it's very interesting. I've said that you saw the online gave this platform for all the eyes to say, I count. Now online you see people reminding each other and reminding all of these various strands how important it is to continue going back into the so-called real world. Because, as I said, without feet on the ground, revolutions would not happen. And the revolution in Egypt continues. It is not over. The revolution in Tunisia continues. It is not over. Because the activists who are very, very nimbly able to move between the real and the virtual recognize that groups and networks like the Muslim Brotherhood, especially the older members of the Muslim Brotherhood, and others who have been involved with on-the-ground activism, they have networks in the real world that many in the social media world need to recreate to strengthen the going back and forth. And so now in Egypt, as we discuss the constitution that is to be written after parliamentary elections, as people discuss when parliamentary elections will happen, because they're supposed to happen in September, but there have been various discussions in Egypt. Tunisia postponed their elections from July to October. When we discuss things like the role of the military in Egypt, I've taken to saying that we've replaced Mubarak with the Supreme Council of Mubaraks, because unfortunately Egypt is ruled right now temporarily is our goal, by the Supreme Military Council, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. They're basically Mubarak's guys. They're basically an extension of the military that has ruled Egypt since 1952, since a military coup ended the monarchy and ended British occupation. So one of the main goals of the revolution from the beginning was that Egypt fall under civilian rule, not military rule. And what you see happening is a real war from the Supreme Military Council against activists, against civilian activists, because we've seen thousands of activists detained, tortured. A blogger was put on military trial and sentenced to 3 years for a blog because he criticized the Supreme Military Council. We've seen torture and detentions, as I said. We've seen virginity tests subjected on women. And here again you see the eyes fighting back with that weapon that they're very familiar with. They continue the street pressure, but they continue the online pressure as well, and the coming together of the two is essential. Because of the torture and the detentions of the military council, 3 or 4 weeks ago, Egyptian activists launched a blog against the SCAF Day. SCAF is the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, and more than 400 bloggers contributed to this. On January the 25th and June the 20th and the 21st, it has been called Blog and Speak Out Against Sexual Harassment Day. So that's to speak out against the military for the virginity test, to speak out against sexual harassment that women continue to face on the streets in Egypt. But it's also a way for women's rights activists to keep the women's rights agenda squarely in focus as we move on with our revolution. And to end, 2 days from now, June 17th, those Saudi women's activists that I mentioned have found the eye and have found a platform to speak out and to level the playing field and to jump over the hurdle of gender segregation and discrimination. June 17 has been labeled Women to Drive Day. 3 weeks ago, a women's rights activist was jailed for several days because she drove her car and uploaded the video on YouTube. This is not, again, the first time that Saudi women have done this. In 1990, 47 Saudi women were jailed and many prevented from traveling and fired from their jobs because they staged a driving demonstration. These now are the daughters of these women. So, as I mentioned, 1989, 1990, the human rights community, 2006, Wael Abbas with that video of torture. These women on June 17 in Saudi Arabia who will drive are the daughters of those women revolutionaries of the 1990s. So I urge you to consider what's happening in the Middle East and North Africa as a continuation of many, many mini revolutions that have been happening, often in isolation, often in invisibility, because that's the way the regime wants them to happen. But now, thanks to social media, internally they can find each other. Externally, we can see them, because social media gives us the way to connect with them. But just as importantly for them inside, the ability to connect the real world and the virtual world is something that they recognize is imperative. And this will be put to the test on June 17th, because all those Saudi women who, again, have said, I will do this, on Facebook, on the Facebook page, or on the various social media sites where they've said, more than 600 Saudi women have said, I will drive my car on June 17th. It's not going to be a mass protest, it's going to be individual women who will get into their car and they've been urged to film themselves and upload the video onto the internet. So they will go. So we will see on June 17th how the eyes who have connected online are able to translate that connection onto the streets, and if they really will go out and drive or not. How's my time doing, Lily? Yeah? Okay. Are we opening it for Q&A, or should I just wrap up? So how about I do that then? Because I would like to stop there with the Saudi women, and then if you have any questions, I can touch on anything I didn't talk about through them. Thank you very much.
So what's next for you? What are you going to do next?
Personally or professionally or?
Yeah, well, professionally.
Well, I do this a lot. Most of my time since the revolution has gone into public speaking, because it's very important for me to get this kind of message out. It's very important for me to keep the attention on what's happening in the Middle East and North Africa, because of attention spans, and you know, Egypt got a lot of media attention. Unfortunately, Syria and Yemen and Bahrain and Libya and many other countries are not getting as much attention as Egypt did. So it's a way of keeping that those voices, amplifying those voices essentially. I don't speak for them. I attempt to amplify their voices. I want to go back to Egypt in July and see it for myself because I haven't had a chance since the revolution to go back. I try to go back to Egypt several times a year. And then to see, when I go back, how I can personally contribute. I do eventually want to write a book that brings together all these strands, especially about Egypt. But I want to focus especially on women's rights, because I think that the women's rights issue, as a way of connecting all these things, for me personally, as a feminist, as an Egyptian woman, as a Muslim woman, is very important. So I want to write a book about Egypt, but then a book also about women's rights in the region, and actually not just in the region, but just globally, that touch on these issues that concern me as an Egyptian and as a Muslim. I think you were next.
I would like you to talk about some of the press talks about if the radical Islamists are more organized than everybody else.
Right.
So there's a danger of slipping backwards. So you can talk to that point about whether that's true or not, or how.
Sure. It's important to see that the Muslim Brotherhood are one of the most organized networks in Egypt, and for a reason. Because the Mubarak regime, it always warned its Western allies, its allies here in the US, 5 different US presidents supported the Mubarak regime, and its allies in Europe. The way the Mubarak regime was able to continue, one of the ways it was able to continue was to always say it's either us or these crazy lunatics, the Muslim Brotherhood. And in order to do that, it eviscerated the Muslim Brotherhood. But it couldn't close down the mosque, which is where the Muslim Brotherhood, would gain a lot of support. So you have the Mubarak regime and the Muslim Brotherhood, and basically they eliminated everybody else. So there's a reason that no one else is as organized as the Muslim Brotherhood. It's not that no one wanted it to be that way. They cracked down on them. So yes, they are organized. But it's also important to recognize that the various other voices, despite not having, one umbrella group that they belong to, are there. I mean, consistently, we've seen polls that have shown that there were more liberal voices in Egypt than are recognized outside. There's, I can't remember if it was Pew or what else it was, but a friend of mine is a pollster based in New York, and he's about to publish an essay about this, about the liberal voices they keep finding in Egypt that people don't recognize because all they hear are about the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood are Egyptians, and the Muslim Brotherhood have genuine support inside Egypt. But that support has been put between 20% to 35%, kind of maximum 40%. It's that organizational skill that does worry people, and the time that we have is also another concern. But my major concern is the constitution, because no matter how well the Muslim Brotherhood do in the parliamentary elections, my main concern is to have a constitution that guarantees that if I can vote for them in September or whenever we have the elections, I can vote for someone else, in the next elections, because that's really what's going to help Egypt work. So these first elections might not be a huge success. They might be a huge mess. It's a very short time span. I'm more concerned with how we move ahead and more concerned with how we put together the constitution. There's a lot of debate in Egypt right now about how that constitution will be put together. Is it going to be just those who win seats in parliament who will put it together? Hopefully not, because every Egyptian deserves to have a say in how we put our constitution together. So yes, they are organized. Many other people are scrambling to organize as much as they are, but it's important, or as much as they have, it's important to recognize, though, that the Muslim Brotherhood do not represent all Egyptians. They represent some. They should be in parliament, they should be in government, as should other voices. But I will end by saying that the Muslim Brotherhood themselves are not monolithic, especially the young among the Muslim Brotherhood, because for years now, many young members of the Brotherhood have recognized that the structure of the group mirrors the structure of the Egyptian state, in that it's very top-down. The supreme guide is like their internal Mubarak. And 2 or 3 years ago, young activists in the Muslim Brotherhood were given the choice, either stop blogging or leave the Brotherhood. And some left the Brotherhood because they were using blogs to speak out and say, I can't. So internally they have their own struggles as well. But it's the constitution that, for me, will guarantee how well the revolution continues. Okay. In villages in southern Egypt, they had that on their side. But then you saw even more strands coming together. You had the young people who I've mentioned that were apolitical and had begun to be politicized in 2005. You had women who knew that the Egyptian police, because this was a target. The regime would target women with sexual abuse and assault during demonstrations. This began as an actual campaign by the Egyptian regime in 2005. Anger, years of poverty, years of repression by the Mubarak regime all came together. This was another way of connecting now, and they went out on the street, and average Egyptians who had not called for the January 25th protest, they themselves began to call for the toppling of the Hosni Mubarak regime. They're the ones who started saying, down, down with Hosni Mubarak. So you had a whole bunch of revolutionaries basically running to catch up with these Egyptians who themselves started saying, but you saw women on Twitter, on Facebook, send each other advice on how to protect themselves against being targeted by sexual assault from the regime. So they would send tweets to each other and messages saying things like, if you wear a headscarf, wear 2 headscarves. Don't wear anything with a zipper. Take a can of mace or a can of hairspray, a can of anything, so that you can spray it in the eyes of anyone who tries to assault you. So you saw all these various groups that came together and went out on the street. And when Egyptians saw that happen, it set the imagination on fire, not just in Egypt, but across the Middle East and North Africa. To see an actual Arab leader being forced to flee was amazing. And so those who went out to protest on January the 25th had that on their side, that everybody had watched Ben Ali flee. So when they started marching on the streets in Cairo, in Alexandria, and it's important to remember it wasn't just in Cairo, in Suez streets, but when they went out on the streets on January the 25th, other Egyptians now who had not been involved in any of this, that then galvanized them. And I know from Egyptian revolutionaries who had been taking part in the meetings running up to January the 25th, that the main condition was, we want the resignation of the interior minister in Egypt. But when Egyptians saw them, average Egyptians now, not involved in these committee meetings, saw them march on the street, years of